Imagine waking up one morning, completely healthy. By evening, your body is burning with fever. By the next morning, there are swellings the size of eggs under your arms, on your neck, in your groin. They are black, they are oozing, and they are killing you. Within 3 to 5 days, you are gone. Now imagine this happening, not to one person, not to one village, but to an entire continent. This is the story of the Black Death, the most catastrophic pandemic in recorded human history. A plague so devastating, so swift, so merciless, that it would kill an estimated 1/3 of Europe's entire population in less than 5 years. This is the story of how the world ended, and somehow kept going. To understand how catastrophic the Black Death truly was, we first need to understand the world it entered. By the early 1300s, medieval Europe was at a crossroad. The continent had been experiencing a period of relative growth, populations were rising, cities were expanding, trade routes were flourishing. Towns like Paris, London, Florence, and Venice were busy, noisy, overcrowded hubs of commerce and culture. But it was a fragile prosperity. Medieval cities were filthy by modern standards. Sewage ran in open channels through the streets. Rats, the same rats that would become central characters in this story, lived alongside humans in granaries, homes, and markets. Clean drinking water was a luxury. Medical knowledge was primitive, built largely on the ancient Greek theory of the four humors, which held that disease was caused by imbalances in the body, not by invisible organisms no one yet knew existed. And then there was the trade network. By the mid-1300s, European merchants had established powerful commercial links stretching all the way to Central Asia and China through what we know today as the Silk Road. Goods flowed between East and West, spices, silk, gold, grain. And with those goods traveled something no merchant intended to carry: bacteria. Specifically, Yersinia pestis, one of the deadliest microorganisms ever to evolve on this planet. The exact origins of the Black Death have been debated by historians for centuries. Modern genetic analysis points to Central Asia, likely the region around what is today Kyrgyzstan and northwestern China, as the birthplace of the 14th century plague strain. Recent archaeological discoveries near Lake Ishik-Kul in Kyrgyzstan unearthed medieval grave sites from 1338 and 1339, years before the plague reached Europe. The inscriptions on some headstones actually mention pestilence. Na analysis confirmed the presence of Yersinia pestis in these remains. This is now believed to be one of the earliest documented episodes of the outbreak. From Central Asia, the disease moved. As trade moved westward, the bacterium Yersinia pestis primarily lived in wild rodent populations: marmots, gerbils, squirrels. It was transmitted among them by fleas. When the infected rodent populations in Central Asia began dying in large numbers, the fleas sought new hosts. They found them in black rats, Rattus rattus, the most common rat species found on merchant caravans, ships, and in trade warehouses. And those rats were going places. The moment historians often mark as the true beginning of the Black Death in Europe came in 1346, when the plague reached the Crimean Peninsula, specifically a trading port called Kaffa on the northern shores of the Black Sea. Kaffa was a Genoese merchant colony, and it was under siege by the Mongol Golden Horde. According to the account of Gabriele de Musis, a notary from Piacenza, the Mongol army, which had itself been devastated by plague, began catapulting the bodies of their dead over the city walls of Kaffa, hoping to infect the defenders. Whether or not this biological warfare tactic directly caused the outbreak inside the city is disputed, but what is almost certain is that the plague was already circulating in the region, and when the Genoese merchants finally fled Kaffa by ship in 1347, they carried the disease with them. Those ships landed in Sicily. The Sicilian chronicler Michel da Piazza described the scene vividly. Ships arrived at the port of Messina carrying sailors who were already half dead, their bodies covered in strange, dark swellings. Horrified, the Sicilian authorities ordered the ships out of harbor, but it was too late. The plague had come ashore. Within weeks, it spread to the Sicilian mainland. From Sicily, it moved to Sardinia, Corsica, and the Italian peninsula. By January 1348, it had reached Genoa and Venice, two of the most important trading cities in Europe. From there, the Black Death fanned outward across the continent with terrifying speed. To truly grasp the horror of the Black Death, we need to understand what it did to the human body. Yersinia pestis is a bacterium. It enters the human body most commonly through the bite of an infected flea. Once inside, the bacterium travels to the nearest lymph node, a small gland that is part of the body's immune system, and begins multiplying rapidly. The lymph node swells dramatically, forming what medieval people called a bubo, from the Greek word for groin, since that was one of the most common locations. These buboes could grow to the size of a chicken egg, or even an apple. They were agonizing. They turned black as the tissue began to die, and this, combined with the dark blotches that appeared on the skin from internal bleeding, is likely where the name Black Death originated. Though, interestingly, contemporaries usually just called it the Great Pestilence, or the Great Mortality. Beyond the buboes, victims suffered high fever, chills, headaches, and extreme weakness. In many cases, the infection spread to the lungs, creating what we now call pneumonic plague, which could be transmitted directly from person to person through respiratory droplets. This was even more lethal, and in the most severe form, septicemic plague, the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly, causing death so rapidly that people could go to bed seemingly healthy and never wake up. Medieval physicians were utterly powerless. They had no concept of bacteria. No antibiotics existed. Treatments ranged from bleeding and purging to applying live chickens to the buboes to draw out the poison to simply praying. None of it worked. The death rate for untreated bubonic plague is estimated at between 30 and 60%. For pneumonic plague, it is nearly 100% without treatment. The speed with which the Black Death moved across Europe is one of the most remarkable and horrifying aspects of the entire catastrophe. From Italy, it moved along the trade routes with almost mechanical precision. By the summer of 1348, it had reached France, Spain, and the Balkans. By the end of 1348, it was in England. By 1349, it had torn through Germany, Scandinavia, and Poland. By 1351 and 1352, it had reached Russia and the far corners of Eastern Europe. No mountain range stopped it. No sea slowed it for long. No city, no matter how wealthy or powerful, was spared. Florence, the jewel of the Italian Renaissance, a city of perhaps 90,000 people, lost an estimated 60% of its population in a single year. The great Florentine writer Giovanni Boccaccio survived the plague and documented what he witnessed in the introduction to his famous work, The Decameron. His description remains one of the most harrowing primary accounts ever written. He described neighbors abandoning neighbors, parents abandoning children, carts full of corpses rolling through the streets at night, mass graves where bodies were stacked in layers like cheese between slices of bread. In Paris, a city of roughly 200,000 people, an estimated 50,000 died. In some towns in France and Spain, the mortality rate exceeded 70%. In certain English villages, entire communities were simply wiped out, abandoned, never reoccupied. Their outlines still visible today as deserted medieval villages in the English countryside. And still, it kept moving. When something is this terrifying and this unexplainable, human beings look for reasons. And tragically, in 14th century Europe, the reasons they found were almost always wrong, and often catastrophically unjust. The most common explanation among ordinary people and clergy was divine punishment. God, they believed, was angry. The plague was a judgment on humanity for its sins. In response, a movement known as the flagellants swept across Germany and the Low Countries. Groups of men, sometimes hundreds at a time, would march from town to town, publicly flogging themselves with leather whips tipped with metal studs, drawing blood, crying out for forgiveness. They believed their suffering would appease God's wrath. Pope Clement VI condemned the flagellants, but people were desperate, and where the flagellants sought internal scapegoats, others found external ones. Jewish communities across Europe were accused of causing the plague by poisoning wells. It was a lie, a vicious, baseless conspiracy theory. But in the climate of mass death and mass hysteria, it proved lethal. Pogroms, organized massacres of Jewish communities, broke out across Germany, France, and Switzerland. In Strasbourg, in 1349, approximately 2,000 Jews were burned alive, even though the plague had not yet fully reached the city. In Mainz and Cologne, thousands more were killed. In total, hundreds of Jewish communities were annihilated during the Black Death years. Pope Clement VI issued 2 papal bulls explicitly declaring that Jews were not responsible for the plague, even noting logically that Jews were dying of it too. His decrees were largely ignored. The flagellants, the massacres, the desperate prayers, none of it stopped the plague. The deaths continued. What does it feel like when a third of everyone you know is dead? Contemporary accounts give us some sense of the social collapse that accompanied the biological one. Whole systems that people depended on simply broke down. Priests died alongside their parishioners, leaving communities with no one to administer last rites, a matter of profound importance to medieval Catholics who believed they needed proper sacraments to avoid eternal damnation. So the dying faced not just physical death, but the terror of spiritual abandonment. Doctors, already limited in their ability to help, abandoned their patients out of fear. Courts shut down, markets closed, fields went unplanted and unharvested. In some regions, grain rotted in the fields because there was no one left to bring in the harvest. The dead piled up faster than they could be buried. In many cities, the church eventually gave up insisting on individual graves and open mass pits. Boccaccio described gravediggers making trenches hundreds of feet long and burying the dead in layers. The stench, contemporaries wrote, was overwhelming. Animals were not spared either. Sheep and cattle died in vast numbers, whether from plague itself or simply from neglect as their owners died or fled. Trade networks, which had carried the plague to Europe in the first place, now collapsed under the weight of the catastrophe they had unleashed. The interconnected economy that had defined early 14th century Europe was shattered. Not everyone died. Even in the hardest hit communities, some people survived. Why? Medieval observers were mystified. Some attributed survival to luck, others to virtue, others to the mysterious will of God. Modern science has given us some answers, though the picture remains complex. Genetics played a role. A mutation in a gene known as CCR5, which codes for a protein on the surface of immune cells, may have conferred some resistance to plague. Interestingly, this is the same mutation that provides resistance to HIV. The high mortality of the Black Death may have actually increased the frequency of this mutation in European populations over time, as people who carried it were more likely to survive and pass it on. Behavior also mattered. People who fled early to isolated rural areas or who quarantined themselves, whether by choice or instinct, had better survival odds. Some monasteries that enforced strict isolation survived largely intact. Others that continued to provide care for the sick were devastated. And not all bubonic plague exposures led to infection. The flea transmission model meant that the disease was not perfectly efficient. Geography, housing conditions, rat population density, all of these affected exposure rates. In the Italian port city of Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik, authorities enacted one of the first documented public health measures in response to plague. They required incoming ships and travelers to wait for a period before entering the city. This practice, originally 30 days, bano, was later extended to 40 days and gave us the word we still use today, quarantine, from the Italian quarantina, meaning 40 days. By 1353, the first great wave of the Black Death had mostly subsided in Western Europe, though the plague would return in waves for the next 3 centuries. But even after that first terrible wave passed, Europe would never be the same. The demographic impact alone was staggering. Historians estimate that between 75 and 200 million people died worldwide, with Europe losing somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of its entire population. Some estimates for the most severely affected regions are even higher. It would take Europe nearly 200 years to return to its pre-plague population levels. But the transformations went far deeper than numbers. The feudal system, already under strain, was shattered. With so many peasants dead, labor became scarce. Suddenly, those who had survived had bargaining power they had never possessed before. Serfs demanded wages. Landlords who refused found their fields empty. Across Europe, the rigid hierarchies of medieval society began to loosen. The church, which had been unable to explain or stop the plague, and which had lost enormous numbers of clergy, suffered a profound crisis of authority. The gap it left was filled, in time, by new philosophical and religious movements that questioned old certainties. Some historians trace a direct line from the Black Death to the Renaissance, and eventually to the Protestant Reformation. Art was transformed. The image of the danse macabre, the dance of death, became ubiquitous in European culture. Skeletons leading people of every rank and station, from pope to peasant, in a grim procession toward death. It expressed a new, radical equality in the face of mortality that was deeply alien to the hierarchical thinking of the medieval world. And medicine, for all its failures, was changed too. The sheer scale of the catastrophe forced a reckoning. Autopsies became more accepted. Observation began, slowly, to challenge ancient theory. The seeds of modern epidemiology, the study of how diseases spread through populations, were planted in the desperate, fumbling attempts to understand what had happened. We live in a world shaped by the Black Death, whether we know it or not. The word, quarantine. The institution of public health. The very concept that governments have an obligation to protect their citizens from disease. The loosening of feudal bonds that laid groundwork for modern labor rights. The philosophical questioning of authority that contributed to intellectual revolutions. The genetic legacy carried in some European bloodlines to this day. All of these trace their origins in some measure back to those terrible years between 1347 and 1353. The Black Death killed, conservatively, 25 million Europeans. It killed them horribly and swiftly and without warning. It killed farmers and kings, nuns and merchants, children and grandparents. It killed them in their beds, in the streets, in churches. It killed them alone and in groups, abandoning them in their most desperate moments. And yet, humanity survived. Communities rebuilt, fields were replanted, children were born, cities grew again. Art and philosophy and science moved forward, forever altered by what had passed. Giovanni Boccaccio, who watched Florence lose half its people, went on to write one of the masterpieces of world literature. The Decameron's frame story, of young people fleeing the plague to the countryside and telling each other stories, is itself an act of resistance, an insistence that life, beauty, humor, and love endure even in the shadow of catastrophe. The Black Death was the worst thing that ever happened to medieval Europe, and in its terrible wake, it forced a civilization to grow up, to question, to adapt, to innovate, and ultimately to survive. The plague ended. The world went on, changed, scarred, diminished, but alive. The Yersinia pestis bacterium still exists today. It still circulates in wild rodent populations in parts of Asia, Africa, and even the American Southwest. A handful of human cases are reported every year. But today, we have antibiotics, we have germ theory, we have epidemiology, public health infrastructure, international disease surveillance. We have all of this because of what was lost and what was learned in the darkest years of the 14th century. Remember the dead, and remember what their dying taught us.